My name is Sarah, and I always thought I was happy. 7 years ago, I married Michael, and our marriage seemed so strong. We built a life together, supported each other in our careers, and I believed we had everything we needed. But time changed us both. Michael has always been ambitious, and that was one of the reasons I fell in love with him. But now his career has completely consumed him. Days turned into a series of calls, meetings, and business trips. Our conversations became rare, and the moments when we were together were filled with silence. One evening, when Michael canceled our dinner again because of an important meeting, I stayed home. The plate with his favorite dish was cooling on the table, and I was sitting next to him with a glass of wine. The room was so quiet that I could only hear my own breathing. I remembered the times when we used to talk for hours about our dreams. The time when even silence was warm. Now it was as cold as the winter wind. The next day, during our morning meeting, our new project manager, Nate, walked into our office. He looked confident, his posture exuded calm strength, and his smile was so genuine that everyone in the room took notice. His eyes lingered on me for a few seconds, and I felt my cheeks blush slightly. After the meeting, he came to my table. "Are you Sarah?" "I'm Nate. I heard you were the brains behind the team." I laughed, trying to look casual. "You're probably exaggerating, but thank you." "Never underestimate yourself, Sarah," he said, his gaze intent and a little longer than was customary in business communication. "It was nice to meet you." His words stayed with me all day. The days seemed to drag on forever, but with Nate's arrival in the office, something changed. He became the person whose presence made even routine work a little easier. His openness and friendliness attracted everyone to him, but I felt that his attention was often focused on me. One morning, I came into the office earlier than usual. The silence of the empty room always helped me concentrate. I was flipping through some documents when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Do you always come in first?" I jumped in surprise and turned around. It was Nate, coffee in hand, and a smile that made my heart beat a little faster. "I usually try to use the silence when there are no distractions," I replied, smiling. "In that case, I've broken your idol," he said with feigned remorse, "but you look like you need coffee more than silence right now." "Do you often bring coffee to your colleagues?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Only to those who work harder than they should," he replied. His eyes met mine, and I felt my cheeks flush slightly. Later that day, we crossed paths again at the office when I was returning from my lunch break. He was standing by the window of the conference room, looking out at the city unfolding in front of him. I couldn't help but notice how he looked. His posture was relaxed, but there was something thoughtful in his eyes. "Nate, is something wrong?" I asked as I entered the room. "No, I was just thinking. Sometimes it's good to take a break." I walked closer and stood next to him by the window. "What are you thinking about?" "How fast time is flying. It seems like I've only recently started working here, but I already feel like I've known everyone my whole life," he said, looking at me with a kind of intensity that made me uncomfortable. "That's good," I replied, trying to steer the conversation away from me. "And you, Sarah? You've been here for a long time. Do you ever wonder if you're where you want to be?" His question took me by surprise. I felt something inside me flinch, but I didn't show it. I guess everyone thinks about it from time to time. But I find stability in my work, and that's important. And at home. His voice was quiet, but he sounded genuinely curious. I didn't know what to say. That brief moment made me think about how happy I really am. A few days later, Nate asked me to have coffee after work again. I hesitated for a long time, but eventually agreed. We were sitting in a small cafe on the corner, and the meeting seemed so innocent. "How are you feeling after all these weeks of work?" he asked as we sat at a table by the window. "Tired, but it's a nice tiredness." And you? You look like everything is going according to your plan, I replied. He laughed, leaning closer. I always have plans, but sometimes the best things happen unexpectedly. His gaze lingered on me for longer than was appropriate. I tried to avoid this moment by taking a sip of coffee. You look like a person who keeps a lot to himself, he said, his voice calm but serious. And you look like someone who likes to get into other people's minds, I replied, trying to make it a joke. He tilted his head to the side and smiled. Maybe you're right, but I want to know more about you, Sarah. His words sounded like he was talking about more than just work. The next day at the office, I tried to avoid him, but every time our eyes crossed, I felt my heart sink. I didn't know what was going on, but this tension between us was becoming more and more palpable. It all started so innocently, but I knew something was changing. We crossed paths more and more often by chance. I didn't know if it was a coincidence or if he was deliberately looking for me, but each of our conversations became longer and his eyes deeper. One day I was late for my lunch break. Most of the employees had already returned to the office, and the canteen was almost empty. When I walked in, Nate was sitting at a corner table, engrossed in his laptop. Sarah, did you forget about lunch too? He asked, gesturing for me to sit next to him. I guess my schedule is calling the shots today, I replied, sitting down across from him. Then it's a good coincidence, he said with that confidence that always threw me off balance. I smiled, but I could feel my heart beating faster. You know, Sarah, you come across as someone who is always in control. What do you mean? I asked, trying to look calm. You hide the real you. I can see that. His gaze was so piercing that I couldn't help but smile, which was more like a defensive reaction. Maybe it's just your ability to see what isn't there, I replied, getting up to go back to work. He didn't try to stop me, but his gaze stayed with me all day. The following week, our closeness became even more apparent. We worked on a joint project and spent more time together. One evening, when everyone had already gone home, we stayed in the office. The atmosphere was quiet, almost intimate. Are you tired? Nate asked as I massaged my temples. I don't think I can tell if it's tired or just routine anymore, I replied, looking at him across the table. You need to relax, Sarah. Life doesn't have to be so hard. His voice sounded so convincing that I laughed involuntarily. What do you suggest? Do something to remind you what it's like to live. I looked at him, trying to figure out if he was serious. Like what? I finally asked, drinking a glass of wine with good company. What do you think? I hesitated but nodded. We went to a bar nearby, and that meeting changed everything. The bar was quiet, a few people were sitting at tables, and we took a seat in a cozy corner. Nate ordered red wine for us, and I could feel the tension building between us. Are you always this serious? He asked as we sat there holding our glasses. I guess that's my defense reaction, I replied, looking away. What if I told you that you could be yourself around me? His words were so unexpected that I barely had time to respond. I don't even know who I am, Nate. Sometimes I feel like I've lost myself. Sarah, you're incredible. I see it, even if you don't. Our eyes met, and I felt an invisible spark between us. Everything I wanted to say disappeared, and I just sat there trying to hide what I was feeling. After that evening, I realized that I could no longer ignore the feelings that began to grow inside me. Every moment we spent together became more intense. One day, when we were leaving the office together, Nate stopped at the door and looked at me. Sarah, I know you feel this way, just like I do. I froze, my heart pounding. Nate, this isn't right, I whispered, trying to find the words. He came one step closer, and I realized that our story was just beginning. That evening, I stayed in the office longer than usual. The joint project required effort, and I wanted to finish everything by the end of the week. There were only a few people left in the office, but by 8 p.m., I noticed that everyone had already left. It was just me and Nate in the room. I was sitting at my desk, deep in my reports, when I heard his footsteps. He walked into my office with a cup of tea in his hands. "Looks like we're the last ones in again," he said, placing the cup in front of me. "I think it's becoming a habit," I replied without looking up. "Sarah, you're so tense," he said, sitting down next to me. "You need to learn to relax." I looked up and our eyes met. His eyes were soft, but piercing at the same time. "My work helps me not to think about other things," I admitted. "And what are those other things?" His voice was quiet, but serious. I held my breath, not knowing what to say. "Sarah," he whispered, "I can't hide it anymore. You're important to me." My heart beat faster. I knew these words would change everything. "Nate, this isn't right," I said, but my voice was quiet and unsure. "But it's true. And you know it," he replied, gently taking my hand in his. Before I could answer, he leaned down and touched my lips. It was a soft and hesitant kiss, but it awakened something long forgotten in me. After that evening, everything changed. We started to find moments to be alone. In the conference room, during lunch breaks, even in the lift. Every touch, every look was full of meaning. One day, he asked me to go out to dinner with him. I hesitated, but eventually agreed. We chose a restaurant on the other side of town where no one knew us. The evening was filled with a lightness I hadn't felt in a long time. Nate was so attentive that I even forgot about my fears. "Sarah, do you know you make me feel better?" he said, looking at me across the table. "Better?" I was surprised, but his words made me smile. I didn't know what to say. His words were so simple, but they hit me right in the heart. After dinner, he suggested we go for a walk. We walked through the streets, talking about everything, and it seemed like time had stopped. When we got to his car, he stopped and turned to me. "Sarah, do you understand that I can't stop?" he said, looking me in the eye. My heart was pounding, but I knew he was right. "Neither do I replied, and those words were the final confession. A few days later, we rented a small room in a hotel on the outskirts of the city. It was a quiet and cozy hotel where no one could find us. I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at my reflection in the mirror. Nate came up to me and hugged me from behind. "Sarah, don't you regret this?" he asked. I looked at his reflection in the mirror. His hug was warm and his voice was calm.
"No, Nate."
"But I'm afraid of what's going to happen next." He held my gaze and whispered, "I know it's wrong, but I'm scared, too. I'm afraid of losing you, even if we're not supposed to be together." His confession left me speechless. Those moments seemed perfect to me, but I knew we were building a castle on sand. The next day at the office, I felt like I was between two realities. When I got home, Michael greeted me with a question. "How was your day?" His simple question triggered a feeling of guilt that began to consume me. I knew that my story with Nate couldn't remain a secret forever. Michael left that evening, leaving me alone in the wreckage of our lives. I did not know where he had gone, or if he would ever return. My thoughts were chaotic as I tried to understand how it had all come to this. "Michael knows," I said, trying not to cry. "Sarah, I'm here. We'll figure it out." He sounded confident, but I could tell he was worried too. The next day, Michael came home. His face was serious but calm. He sat down at the table and gestured for me to sit across from him. "I want you to tell me the whole truth," he said. "I don't want any more half-truths or excuses." My hands were shaking, and I could barely speak. "It happened. I don't know how to explain it. I lost myself, and you were so busy that I found it elsewhere." His eyes flashed with pain. "Is that your excuse?"
"No."
I'm not making excuses for myself, Michael. I made a mistake, and I don't know if I can fix it. He shook his head. Do you want to fix it? This question stopped me.
I didn't know what to say.
Michael took some photos out of his pocket and threw them on the table. It was me and Nate in a cafe outside the hotel. I gasped when I saw them. They were printed as if from an old camera, but I couldn't figure out who could have done it. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Your constant confusion, coming home late. An anonymous person sent me this. But it doesn't matter now. I want you to decide. A few days later, I decided to meet with Nate to discuss how to proceed. We agreed to meet at a cafe. I was sitting at a table waiting for him, but to my surprise, Michael came instead. I knew you'd be here, he said, and I knew he'd come too. Michael, it's not what you think. I started, but he interrupted me. It is exactly what I think, Sarah. I've been watching you for weeks, and now I want you to make a choice.
His words took me by surprise.
A choice? Yes, a choice. Between what we have left and what you've decided to destroy. At that moment, Nate walked into the cafe. He saw us and stopped. His eyes met mine, but he didn't come over. There was something else in his eyes, something like despair. I realized that it had been too much for him.
Michael looked at me. You're going to do it now.
You have to choose. My heart was pounding.
I didn't know what to say.
Nate was waiting for me at the door, and Michael was sitting across from me, looking at me with his last hope. I got up and took a few steps, but stopped. Everything I had done suddenly came crashing down on me. I realized that in trying to find myself, I had lost everything that was important. I choose me, I finally said. Michael shook his head and stood up. It doesn't matter anymore, Sarah. You've lost us both. He left the cafe, and I was left standing in the middle of the room, watching Nate slowly turn around and leave as well. I left my job to start a new chapter in my life. My marriage to Michael was over, and I didn't see Nate anymore. I was now living alone. And although the loneliness was sometimes painful, I finally started to feel free. I realized that my mistakes had been a lesson that showed me the importance of being honest with myself. I started volunteering at a local center, helping women in difficult life circumstances. It helped me to rethink my own life. One day, I received a letter. It had only one sentence. I will always remember you, Nate. I smiled, but it was filled with sadness. Life could not be turned back, but I could move forward.
Please subscribe to our channel Stellar Stories. We have new amazing stories coming out every day. Thank you.